Hi, John Gadd here from tkArena again. This week we're going to be talking about benchmarking, the ethics behind benchmarking. I've spent a lot of time in the industry and I've worked on both sides of the fence as far as benchmarking is concerned. I've seen what happens when you don't optimize drivers for a particular benchmark, and I've seen what it can do as far as deceiving your customers as well. The first time I experienced this was probably just after the launch of Quake 3, when I was doing some testing on one of the first next generation DirectX 8 cards from S3. This particular card didn't actually hit the market, only went into laptops and stuff like that. But what I was noticing, and when I was doing my tests in the labs here, was that some of the graphics quality on the S3 card was far superior to some of the other stuff that was out there. Although these cards were outperforming it dramatically in benchmarks, especially time demo type benchmarks like the Quake 3 time demo. Then we all discovered the Quake 3 or Quack 3 benchmark cheats that were implemented in some of the drivers out there. This type of optimizations, or these types of optimizations, have been going on for years, and it's almost made it irrelevant to benchmark a PC now, because especially when you're trying to compare different processors or different video cards. Video cards are probably the main culprit, but I've just recently discovered some processor cheating as well that's out there in synthetic benchmarks. It's making it almost impossible for manufacturers to get a fair comparison between products, and also the end user like yourself to see a realistic comparison of how a processor really performs. HardOCP recently done an article talking about their recent benchmarks on one of the latest GPUs that come out, where people criticise them for not providing the synthetic type benchmarks. I can understand where Kyle's coming from there, where a lot of these synthetic benchmarks, especially when you're comparing against GPUs, really aren't giving the end user a realistic solution or a realistic decision on what card to get, or what card's faster, or what card's slower, or where does it perform or doesn't perform. The only real way to test it is by real-world gaming. Now, in a lab, it's not always possible. I'm running some tests here and doing some of these synthetic benchmarks, and what I find, although they're give you a good general idea of how a card performs or how a CPU performs and what's working and what's not working, I don't think I could possibly use it to judge how fast the system is. The only way really to do it is actually to physically play a game, or physically play or use an application and see how it responds. The same thing happens with Windows XP and Windows Vista. All these benchmarks come out where they're saying, oh, Vista is so much slower, etc., etc. But in all honesty, it's starting to come out now that realistically, Windows XP is just made to look faster than Windows Vista. It's not necessarily faster. It's the way in which you access things and the way it caches files, and when it pops up with OK or when it doesn't pop up with OK. And things like defragmenting the hard drive and optimizing the system and stuff like that all has to come into play. Vista is going to be a very hard operating system, or not going to be, it is a very hard operating system to benchmark, especially in the first couple of days when it's trying to do things like defragment your hard drive and work out what you're using on a regular basis, etc. Why it's doing all this is using a lot of system resources and also skewing your benchmarks at the same time, because it's trying to do something else while you're trying to benchmark. For that particular reason, I've switched back over to Windows XP 64-bit for most of my benchmarking, especially on the CPU side of stuff. With the graphics side of stuff, I'm going to go back to Windows Vista, and we're just going to have to run the systems for a few days before we start any benchmarking to make sure we get all the kinks out of the system. But what we're going to do here is not only run synthetic benchmarks like, let's have a look here, 3D Mark 06. We'll run this type of test, but we'll never use this type of test to compare two different systems, especially with two different graphics cards in there. What we'll do is look at this benchmark and see what type of effect modifications to one particular system does. Things like optimizing RAM settings or optimizing CPU speeds, etc. You can tell what happens there, but if you try and swap between brand CPUs, chipsets or graphics cards, it really gives you skewed results, and it's not always reliable. But definitely for optimizing your PC and tweaking your PC and seeing what type of results you get, it's a good baseline to start with. These benchmarks give you a lot of different information about where performance is increasing and where it's not increasing. 3D Mark 06 actually does use most of the cores in the CPU, where most of the games that I'm testing do not. Very rarely I'm seeing more than 1 or 2 cores being used at any one time. And quite often I'm also, in some of the hardcore games, I'm seeing the CPU, one or two of the cores getting maxed out and sitting there chugging along, and it's definitely a CPU bottleneck, and the other two cores are just sitting there twiddling their thumbs waiting for something to do. So this has all been really interesting over the last couple of weeks, and it's taking a little bit longer than I expected, mainly because I'm going to give you a lot more information than I initially intended it as well. Hopefully the way in which we do end up benchmarking here at tkArena is up to your specifications, but if it's not and you would like us to do something a little bit different, let us know, and we'll do our best to accommodate everybody. This is John Gatt from tkArena. We'll talk to you next time.